to me, the polls in the last 10 years, or at least in the last 5 years, let's say in the age of Trump, have just become completely meaningless at this point.
As I write this video, President Trump's re-election prospects are looking pretty grim. I'm not a gambler, but if I had to place a bet on this contest, at this point I'd go with Biden. 5 months ago, I would have said the smart money was on Trump. All other noise and nonsense aside, Trump is the incumbent, and incumbents usually win. But like it did with so many other things, the pandemic really threw a wrench into this election. Of course, you Trump fans shouldn't be too worried. Yeah, Biden does have a pretty strong lead in the polls, but so did Hillary Clinton, and we all know how that worked out. The polls were wrong in 2016. So there's a good chance they could be wrong again. At least that's what all the real journalists tell me.
In 2016, the polls were wrong and the predictions were wrong. Hillary Clinton was heavily favored to win, but she lost. Since then, people have been asking, why were the polls so off? And some have said maybe it's because the people being polled do not represent those who voted for Donald Trump. That you had independents, you had former Democrats, and you had new voters supporting the president.
Tim Pool calling it like it is, like he always does. Of course, Tim has integrity, unlike all of the mainstream media, which seems to be writing Trump off as of now, just like they did last time around. Of course, to be fair, there were some people in legacy media who accurately predicted Trump's victory. Peggy Noonan over at the Wall Street Journal was one of those people. As Noonan wrote in her blog the day before the election, "We begin with 3 words everyone writing about the election must say. Nobody knows anything. Everyone's guessing. Who knows what to make of the weighing of the polls and the assumptions as to who will vote? Who knows the depth and breadth of each party's turnout efforts?" Among the wisest words spoken this cycle were by John Dickerson of CBS News and Slate, who said in a conversation right before the last presidential debate that he thought maybe the American people were quietly cooking something up, something we don't know about. I think they are, and I think it's this: a Trump win. Trump's crowds are building. 28,000 in Mooresville, Pennsylvania last night, 30,000 in Westchester, Ohio, Friday. It isn't only a triumph of advanced planning. People came, they got through security, and waited for hours in the cold. There is no denying that Republicans have the passion now, the enthusiasm. The Democrats do not. Independents are breaking for Trump. And there's the thing about yard signs. In Florida, a few weeks ago, I saw Trump signs, not Clinton ones. From Ohio, I hear the same. From Tony Northwest, Washington, D.C., I hear the same. Is it possible this whole thing is playing out before our eyes and we're really not noticing because we're too busy looking at data on paper instead of what's in front of us? Maybe that's the real distortion of the polls this year. They left us discounting the world around us. Wow. That was prescient, now wasn't it? She totally called it. She knew the polls were not accurately representing what was actually happening on the ground. She saw that Trump had larger, more enthusiastic crowds and accurately predicted his victory. Again, Noonan wrote this article the day before the election, which is why, 48 hours later, she was totally humiliated. You see, the blog post I just read you was real, but it was from 2012. I swapped Trump for Romney and Clinton for Obama. The lesson here should be obvious. Anecdotal evidence in elections is meaningless. As we'll see later, Peggy Noonan was hardly unique in this perspective in 2012. But first, let's talk about this election. When I run into Trump supporters online and in real life, most of them seem pretty confident that the president will be reelected. This electoral map, which had Trump winning 44 states, was making the rounds on Twitter. Someone in the replies honestly believed that Trump had a chance of flipping California. Trump does have a chance of winning, but if he does win, the map will not look like this. It will probably look pretty similar to the way it did in 2016. Trump winning 44 states, including Massachusetts, will never happen. The map where Jeb Bush miraculously wins every state has a better chance of becoming reality than that does. To be fair though, leaving out the crazies, I kind of get why some Trump supporters are having deja vu. At first glance, 2020 does seem a lot like 2016. Trump is behind in the polls and the mainstream media is rather arrogantly dismissing him at this point, just like they did last time around. Furthermore, most of his supporters don't seem troubled by the fact that he's behind in the polls, because, as we discussed earlier, the polls were wrong in 2016. Here's the problem though, Trump supporters. That's not exactly true. As Nate Silver writes, polls of the November 2016 presidential election were about as accurate as polls of presidential elections have been on average since 1972. And polls of gubernatorial and congressional elections in 2016 were about as accurate on average as polls of those races since 1998. Furthermore, polls of elections since 2016, meaning the 2017 gubernatorial elections and the various special elections to Congress this year and last year, have been slightly more accurate than average. The media narrative that polling accuracy has taken a nosedive is mostly bullshit. In other words, polls were never as good as the media assumed they were before 2016, and they aren't nearly as bad as the media seems to assume they are now. In reality, not much has changed. So if we look back at the national polls for the previous two presidential elections, we see that in 2016 the RCP average had Clinton up by 3.3 points. She ended up winning the popular votes by 2.1 points, a difference of 1.2 points. If we look at 2012, the RCP average had Obama beating Romney by 0.7 points. Obama ended up winning the popular vote by 3.9 points, a difference of 3.2 points. In other words, the national polls were actually more accurate in 2016 than they were in 2012. But of course, we don't elect our president by popular vote. Only the Electoral College matters. So what about the key swing states? Well, as Ron Fascio writes in The Hill, in Florida, the largest of the swing states, the average of the final three polls had Trump ahead by 0.3 of a point. He won the state by 1.2 points. Ohio's last poll gave Trump a 7-point lead, and he carried it by 8.1 points. The average of the three final polls in Pennsylvania had Clinton leading by a single point, and the last poll taken had Trump ahead by a point. He won the state by 0.7 of a point. In Michigan, the two final polls had Clinton ahead by an average of only 1.5 points. The later one gave Trump a 2-point lead. He won by 0.2 of a point. The average of the final four polls in North Carolina had Trump ahead by 0.5 of a point, although he won the state by a more robust 3.7 points. So we see that the polling certainly wasn't perfect in the swing states, but it wasn't wildly off either. The only swing state where pollsters really dropped the ball was my home state of Wisconsin, where the two final polls had Clinton ahead by an average of 7 points. Trump ended up winning the state by 0.8 of a point. However, both of those polls were taken over a week out. As Fascio notes, polls are pictures in time, not crystal balls. They look backward, not forward. They can't predict what occurs after they're conducted. When polling shuts down too early, which happened in Wisconsin and other places, it misses the final breaks. And in this topsy-turvy election, it was last-minute movement in a few states that gave Trump his sensational victory. Exit polling found that late deciders in Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin broke for Trump by double-digit margins as high as 29 points. So there are two lessons here. 1. Don't get your news from Tim Pool. You will be consistently misinformed. 2. And this one especially goes out to you Trump supporters in the audience. You don't get to shout Butma 2016 and wish away numbers you don't like. It's funny how short memories are here on the internet. It's true that on election night 2016, a ton of media personalities had an awful lot of egg on their faces when Donald Trump won. While it wasn't nearly to the same extent, a similar thing happened on election night 2012 to a lot of conservatives. I mentioned earlier that Peggy Noonan wasn't unique in her assessment. If anything, when she said no one knows what the outcome will be, she was a bit more reserved compared to some of her fellow travelers. A ton of people on the right weren't just convinced that the polls were wrong. They believed that polling companies were actively skewing their results to show Obama ahead. As Ben Shapiro tweeted out a week before the election, why is anybody shocked by poll bias? The polls are run by the same folks who run the mainstream media. John Nolte, who was an editor for Breitbart, wrote several articles claiming that the polls were being juiced by oversampling Democratic voters. This dude named Dean Chambers made a website called unskewedpolls.com, where he adjusted turnout to levels where they equally sampled Democrats and Republicans, which of course gave Romney the lead. Dick Morris was probably the most bullish of all.
So you are standing by your prediction of a Romney landslide?
Absolutely. Romney will win this election by 5 to 10 points in the popular vote and will carry more than 300 electoral votes.
All right.
All of these people and more issued mea culpas on election night when Obama won. Dick Morris was actually fired from Fox News. The one time in my life that someone was fired from cable news for saying something that was purely stupid. If ever anyone deserved to be canceled, it was Dick Morris. Now, while these people held up the fig leaf of inflated turnout projections as evidence, they also used a fair number of anecdotes to make their case. They talked about rally sizes and yard signs, as we heard from Peggy Noonan. But my personal favorite example of this was when they would reference the large turnout for Chick-fil-A Appreciation Day, a highly successful boycott organized by Mike Huckabee after the chicken company faced backlash because their CEO came out against gay marriage. As David Limbaugh wrote in his article, 10 Reasons Why Mitt Will Win, conservatives have never been more motivated. Americans rejected Obama's radical liberalism. Scott Brown won Ted Kennedy's seat, Democrats took a shellacking in the 2010 congressional races, Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker won, a strong majority of Americans still hate Obama's proudest achievement, Obamacare. The Tea Party is more energized than ever, and grassroots Americans voted with their bellies for Chick-fil-A. This reminds me of when Trump supporters gloat about how Goya beans are selling out, or when they tell me that the president's Twitter presence and his pre-pandemic rally sizes demonstrate that he has more support than Biden. It's deja vu all over again. Trump supporters should do themselves a favor and learn a lesson that Bernie Sanders supporters figured out a little too late. Those things don't mean anything. Online isn't real life. If having a Twitter mob was demonstrative of actual on-the-ground support, then the Democratic primary would have been a three-way race between Tulsi Gabbard, Andrew Yang, and Bernie Sanders. If you disparaged any one of them on Twitter, you'd have a million idiots in your mentions telling you to go kill yourself. Very online people like Joe Rogan absolutely loved these three. But when election time came, no one actually voted for Yang or Gabbard. Bernie started out strong, but was later steamrolled by Biden. Rallies, of course, do happen in real life, but they're not indicative of broad support. It just means that you got a lot of people to show up to listen to you talk. It doesn't mean that more people are going to vote for you. Like I pointed out earlier, as Election Day approached in 2012, Mitt Romney was drawing crowds that rivaled and sometimes even beat Obama's, and they were definitely more enthusiastic. This realization is a bitter pill that an awful lot of burners have yet to swallow. Credit to Cenk Uygur of all people for his willingness to tell his audience the truth.
So Focus on Infinity says, Bernie's packing stadiums and Biden can't fill school gyms. Are we supposed to believe there's nothing weird going on at all? Dig deeper, you all, come on. No, there's nothing weird going on. So we're telling you what the real phenomenon are. And we get smeared for that, and we get called every name in the book for that. The bias of the mainstream media is real and massive and determinative, okay? But they're not actually rigging the votes. You could have massive rallies and still get a giant number of votes and get 40%. So Romney, look, he didn't have rallies as big as Bernie or Trump, to be honest, and certainly not Obama. But Romney did have very, very large rallies, and he got himself to believe that he was going to win the election because of the large rallies. I'll tell you, I had this brief experience, as you all know, running for Congress. We had not only really good turnout at our events, but we had so much anecdotal evidence that we were doing really well. Anecdotal evidence ain't real. It's small, it's something, it gives you maybe a little sense of it, but polling is more real, it just is, and the vote is more real. So no, there's nothing conspiratorial going on. Older voters don't go to rallies, but they do go to the voting booth. They just do.
My friend Sean over at the channel Actual Justice Warrior accurately predicted that Biden would be the nominee thanks to his high marks of support with older black voters.
Now, Joe Biden has a little bit of progressive support, but that's not where his path to the nomination lies. Where his path to the nomination lies is amongst black voters. Joe Biden is really popular amongst African Americans, especially African American Democrats. He was the vice president for the first African American president in history.
You see, elderly black people generally don't go to rallies. They certainly don't bombard you on Twitter. However, when election day comes around, they actually bother to show up to the polls and vote. And that's what actually matters. You don't get points for more enthusiastic voters. This is something a lot of people on the internet have yet to get their heads around. In 2016, Donald Trump did have much bigger rallies than Hillary Clinton, and he did have more enthusiastic supporters on the internet. And of course, he did win. A lot of people took away from this that those two things are somehow necessary conditions for winning, or at the very least, a candidate who has these things will surely beat one who doesn't. This is not true. Even the 2016 election doesn't cash out this claim. The attendance at Trump's rallies and his levels of online support were indeed several orders of magnitude larger than Hillary's. If these things actually tracked with election results, he should have crushed Hillary. In reality, he only won by about 70,000 votes in 3 states. As you all know, Clinton actually got 3 million more votes than Trump did, but that's not how we elect our president. I should also point out that the lead that Hillary Clinton had over Donald Trump in 2016 can't hold a candle to Biden's lead right now. We're about 100 days out from the election. At this point during the election 4 years ago, Hillary had, on average, about a 4-point lead in the national polls. According to the same average, Biden has an 8.7% lead right now. Biden also has a larger lead in swing states than Hillary ever did. While I don't think that Biden will win them, traditionally red states like Georgia and Texas are now in play. Alternatively, at this point, 4 years ago, traditional swing states like Ohio and Iowa had more or less slipped away from Hillary. According to Nate Cohn over at the New York Times' The Upshot, even if the polls were as wrong this year as they were in 2016, Biden will still rake in 310 electoral college votes. A comfortable victory. In other words, if there is a secret Trump vote that is not being picked up by the pollsters for whatever reason, it's going to have to be a lot bigger than it was last time around. Now, let me be perfectly clear here. None of this is to say that Trump cannot win. Like I said earlier, we're about 100 days out from the big day. A lot can happen in that period of time. 100 days ago, things were still very close. I could easily see things getting back there. Who knows what will happen with the pandemic, the economy, or any number of things between now and November 3rd. And there are still the debates. My point is, as of now, things are not looking good for the president, and all the anecdotal evidence in the world doesn't change that, Dave Rubin.
I'm telling you, just walking my dog around the street, a lot of people are coming up to me and saying, I've been a Democrat my whole life, and I'm
Dude, I
voting
hope
for
you're
Trump, and I'm buying the guns, and all kinds of stuff.
If things do start to turn in the president's favor, we will likely see that reflected in the polls. But as of now, sorry Trump supporters, your boy is losing.